Welcome to Love's Outlaw Embrace, a gripping Wild West saga of danger and forbidden passion. Enter a remote frontier town where whispers on the wind hint at secrets buried in the dust. A healer's quiet life is swept into a whirlwind of peril and heart when fate binds her to a shadowed outlaw world. Join us as the sagebrush bends and the journey begins in Dusterville. Chapter 1. Whispers into the Wind. The wind carried secrets through Dusterville, secrets in the scent of sagebrush after a rare, fleeting rain. It whipped Isabella's calico skirts around her ankles as she knelt by the parched earth, coaxing the last of the chamomile blossoms open. Her fingers, stained brown from the soil and the constant handling of herbs, moved with a gentle precision, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn landscape surrounding her. She was a wisp of a thing, really, easily overlooked, but her presence in Dusterville was as vital as the well water that kept the town alive. At 23, Isabella was the closest thing they had to a doctor, a healer learned in the old ways, her knowledge passed down from her grandmother, whispered to be part Apache. She hummed a low tune, a wordless melody that echoed the lonely cry of a hawk circling high above. The sun beat down, a relentless presence in the vast, unforgiving sky. Isabella paused, wiping a stray strand of dark hair from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of dirt on her pale skin. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way the saloon girls were, with their painted faces and bold laughter. Her beauty was quiet, like the desert bloom that appeared only after a storm, a resilient beauty born of hardship, and a deep, unwavering compassion. A shadow fell over her, and for a fleeting moment, she thought it was Elias, the young blacksmith who'd been courting her with clumsy persistence. He'd brought her a horseshoe shaped into a heart last week, the metal still warm from the forge. It was a sweet gesture, a safe gesture, and a part of her, the practical part, wished she could feel something more than a gentle fondness for him. But the shadow was too large, too menacing. Isabella looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. 3 men towered over her, their faces obscured by the wide brims of their hats and the dust that clung to them like a second skin. They were riders, hard men, the kind who carried the scent of gun smoke and trouble with them like a permanent shroud. The one in the middle, the tallest, dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his rough exterior. He was all sharp angles and lean muscle, a predator in human form. That was no Elias. "Afternoon, miss," the tall man said, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down Isabella's spine. It wasn't a greeting, not really. It was an announcement. Isabella rose slowly, clutching her basket of herbs to her chest. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Her voice was surprisingly steady, betraying none of the fear that was churning in her stomach. She'd dealt with rough men before. Dusterville had its share. But these men were different. "We got a man hurt," the tall man said, his eyes, the color of flint, fixed on her with unsettling intensity. "Bad hurt. We need your help." Isabella's gaze flickered to the other 2 men still mounted. One was cradling his arm, his face pale and drawn. The other was simply watching, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. There was no pretense of politeness, no request in their posture. It was a demand. "I'll tend to him," Isabella said, her mind racing. She could try to run, but she knew it was futile. They were on horseback. She was on foot. And Dusterville, even if she could reach it, offered little protection against men like these. Besides, her oath, the one she'd whispered to her grandmother on her deathbed, bound her. Heal those who need it, regardless of who they are. "Not here," the tall man said, his gaze sweeping the open prairie. "You'll come with us." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. "Kidnapping a healer won't earn you any favors with the law," she said. trying to inject a note of defiance into her voice. The tall man gave a short, harsh laugh. "The law ain't got much reach out here, miss, and we ain't particularly concerned with favors." He gestured with his head towards one of the horses. "Get on." There was no room for argument. Isabella knew that. She took a deep breath, the scent of sage and dust filling her lungs, a scent that suddenly felt more menacing than comforting. She looked towards Dusterville, a cluster of buildings shimmering in the distance, a mirage of safety she couldn't reach. Elias was probably at his forge, hammering metal, oblivious to the danger she was in. A wave of sadness washed over her, a sadness for the life she might be leaving behind, the simple life she had carved out for herself. With a sigh of resignation, Isabella handed her basket to one of the riders, the one with the injured arm. He took it with a grunt, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and suspicion. Then the tall man reached down, his hand surprisingly gentle as he helped her onto the back of his horse. His touch sent a jolt through her, a strange mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite name. As they rode away from Dusterville, away from everything she knew, Isabella looked back one last time. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of chamomile and the faint, haunting melody of her grandmother's song. It felt like a goodbye, and as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, ominous shadows across the prairie, Isabella knew that her life had irrevocably changed. She was riding into the unknown, into the heart of danger, with a man whose eyes held the cold fire of the wilderness, a man known only as Maverick. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a flicker of something else ignited, a spark of defiance, a whisper of curiosity, and the undeniable pull of a fate she could no longer outrun. The air was heavy with the scent of dust, horse sweat, and the metallic tang of blood. The silence between them and the steady rhythm of the horse were the only proof that time was still moving. Chapter 2. The Serpent's Coil. The journey was a blur of dust and relentless sun. Isabella, perched precariously behind Maverick, clung to his shirt, the rough fabric a small comfort in a terrifying situation. She tried to memorize the route, the twists and turns through the increasingly rugged terrain, but it was a futile effort. They were heading deeper into the wilderness, into a landscape that seemed to swallow all hope. Maverick didn't speak, and neither did the other two riders. The injured man, whose name she learned was Silas, groaned occasionally, his pain a palpable presence. The other rider, a wiry man with a cruel scar that bisected his lip, remained a silent, watchful shadow. Isabella felt their eyes on her, assessing, judging, and the weight of their scrutiny was almost as heavy as the fear that coiled in her stomach. She tried to focus on the rhythm of the horse's hooves, on the steady rise and fall of Maverick's back beneath her hands. She noticed the way his muscles tensed with each movement, the strength that radiated from him. A strength that was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. He smelled of leather and wood smoke, a scent that was surprisingly familiar, reminding her of her grandfather, a man who had lived his life on the edge of civilization. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they reached their destination. It wasn't a town, not even a settlement. It was a hidden canyon, a narrow gorge carved into the rock, a place where shadows lingered even in the brightest daylight. A crude camp was set up near a small trickling stream, a fire already burning, casting flickering shadows on the canyon walls. Several other men were waiting, their faces hardened and wary. They looked at Isabella with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, their eyes lingering on her healer's bag, which Silas had tossed carelessly onto the ground. This was their world, a world of outlaws and renegades, a world far removed from the quiet predictability of Dusterville. Maverick dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful. He helped Isabella down, his hand lingering on her waist for a moment longer than necessary. The contact sent a shiver through her, a reaction she tried to ignore. "This is Isabella," Maverick said, his voice cutting through the silence. "She's a healer. She's here to help Ben." The men murmured amongst themselves, their eyes shifting towards a figure lying on a bedroll near the fire. He was young, younger than Maverick, his face pale and drawn with pain. A blood-soaked bandage was wrapped around his thigh, the crimson stain spreading alarmingly. Isabella's fear momentarily receded, replaced by a familiar sense of purpose. This was what she was trained for and what she was meant to do. She knelt beside the injured man, her fingers gently probing the wound. It was a gunshot wound, deep and messy. Infection was already setting in, and the skin around the wound hot and inflamed. "I need hot water," Isabella said, her voice clear and authoritative. "And clean cloths, and my bag." One of the men, a burly fellow with a thick beard, fetched her bag. Another brought a kettle of water from the fire. Isabella worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the wound, removing the bullet fragments, and applying a poultice of herbs she'd gathered along the way. Her hands moved with a confidence that belied her inner turmoil. Maverick watched her, his expression unreadable. He stood apart from the others, a silent observer, his presence a constant, unsettling force. Isabella could feel his gaze on her, and it made her acutely aware of her vulnerability, of the precariousness of her situation. As she worked, she learned more about Ben, Maverick's younger brother. He'd been shot during a botched robbery, a foolish attempt to prove himself to the older, more seasoned outlaws. He was reckless and impulsive, driven by a desperate need for his brother's approval. "He looks up to you," Isabella said quietly to Maverick, as she finished bandaging Ben's wound. Maverick didn't respond, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of pain, of regret. He turned away, his shoulders slumping slightly. The night was long and filled with tension. Isabella stayed by Ben's side, monitoring his fever, changing his bandages, and administering herbal teas to ease his pain. The outlaws kept their distance, their suspicion palpable, but they didn't interfere. They were a rough bunch, hardened by a life of violence and hardship, but they respected Isabella's skill, her dedication. As the first rays of dawn crept over the canyon walls, Ben's fever finally broke. He opened his eyes, his gaze focusing on Isabella. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice weak but sincere. Isabella smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You're welcome." She looked up and saw Maverick watching her, his expression softened. A hint of warmth in his eyes. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her efforts. In that moment, something shifted between them, a fragile connection forged in the crucible of danger and desperation. The fear was still there, the uncertainty, but it was tempered by something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The canyon, with its towering walls and hidden depths, felt like a serpent's coil, tightening its grip around her. And Maverick, the enigmatic outlaw, was the serpent's head, both dangerous and alluring, and she found herself drawn to him in a way she could not explain, not yet. The only sound was the crackling of the dying embers of the fire, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the wounded man. Chapter 3. Stolen Remedies, Stolen Hearts. Days bled into a routine, as much as a routine could exist in an outlaw camp. Isabella settled into a rhythm of tending to Ben, her days punctuated by the mundane tasks of gathering herbs, preparing meals, and navigating the unspoken rules of this dangerous new world. The canyon, initially a symbol of confinement, began to feel strangely familiar, its harsh beauty a stark contrast to the gentle rolling hills of Dusterville. The outlaws, initially wary and distant, began to thaw, their suspicion replaced by a grudging respect. They saw her tending not only to Ben, but to their own minor ailments, cuts, bruises, burns, with the same quiet competence and unwavering compassion. She was a healer, first and foremost, and that transcended the boundaries of law and lawlessness. Silas, the man with the injured arm, was the first to truly open up. He'd sustained a deep gash during the same raid that had felled Ben. Isabella cleaned and stitched the wound, her touch gentle, despite the man's gruff exterior. He'd flinched, but not from pain. "You got a soft hand for a woman living out here," he'd mumbled, his gaze averted. "I learned from the best," Isabella had replied, thinking of her grandmother. "Your ma?" Isabella shook her head. "My grandmother. She taught me everything I know." Silas had grunted, but he'd allowed her to change his bandages without complaint, his initial hostility replaced by a hesitant trust. The wiry man with the scar, whose name was Finch, remained aloof, his eyes always watching, his silence more menacing than any threat. He was Maverick's closest confidant, a shadow that followed him everywhere, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked beneath the surface. Maverick himself remained an enigma. He was a leader, respected and feared by his men, but he held himself apart, a solitary figure shrouded in mystery. He spoke little, his words carefully chosen, his emotions tightly controlled. Yet Isabella found herself drawn to him, to the vulnerability he tried so hard to conceal. She observed him, the way he interacted with his men, firm but fair, the way he cared for his horses, with a gentleness that belied his outlaw persona, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, his gaze filled with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something that made her heart beat faster. One evening, as she was preparing a poultice for Ben's wound, Maverick approached her. The firelight cast flickering shadows on his face, highlighting the sharp lines of his cheekbones and the intensity of his gaze. "You're good at what you do," he said, his voice low and rough. Isabella looked up, surprised by the compliment. "It's what I was taught." "You could have run," he said, his eyes searching hers. "Back in Dusterville. You could have screamed for help." Isabella met his gaze, her own unwavering. "And what good would that have done? You would have caught me. And Ben would have died." Maverick was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on hers. "You're a strange woman, Isabella." "And you're a strange man, Maverick," she replied, a hint of defiance in her voice. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "That I am." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through her. She didn't pull away. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And where do I belong?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored her own. The unspoken question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their circumstances, of the impossible chasm that separated them. He was an outlaw, a man living outside the law, a man with a price on his head. She was a healer, a woman bound by an oath to do no harm, a woman who valued peace and order. Yet despite all that, despite the danger, despite the impossibility of it all, she felt herself drawn to him, pulled into his orbit like a moth to a flame. Her remedies were stolen, used for a purpose she did not condone, and her heart was beginning to feel stolen too. She felt the warm canyon air against her skin, mixed with the smell of campfire smoke, leather, and the unique scent of Maverick, a scent that was beginning to feel like a dangerous comfort. He withdrew his hand, the moment broken, and stepped back, leaving her with the silence and the unshakable feeling this was only the beginning. Chapter 4. Beneath a Bandit Moon. The moon hung full and luminous in the inky sky, casting a silvery glow over the canyon. It was a bandit moon, Isabella thought, a moon that illuminated secrets and whispered of forbidden desires. The night air was cool, a welcome respite from the scorching heat of the day, and carried the scent of pine and the distant howl of a coyote. Ben was sleeping soundly, his fever gone, his breathing regular. Isabella had done all she could for him. Now it was up to his body to heal. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, wrapped in a blanket, her gaze fixed on the moon. She felt restless, uneasy, her thoughts consumed by Maverick. He was a contradiction, a puzzle she couldn't solve. He was a ruthless outlaw, capable of violence and cruelty, yet he possessed a gentleness, a vulnerability that he kept hidden from the world. She had seen it in the way he cared for his brother, in the way he treated his horses, in the way he looked at her, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored her own. She heard a footstep behind her, the soft crunch of boots on gravel. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Maverick sat down beside her, close but not touching. He didn't speak, and neither did she. They sat in silence, bathed in the moonlight, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant cry of the coyote. "Why did you become an outlaw?" Isabella asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried in the stillness of the night. Maverick didn't answer immediately. He stared into the flames, his profile stark against the flickering light. "It wasn't a choice," he said finally, his voice rough. "Not at first. It was survival." He told her his story, a story of hardship and betrayal, of a family torn apart by poverty and greed. He'd been young, barely a man, when his father had been cheated out of his land, driven to desperation, and ultimately to an early grave. Maverick had been left to care for his mother and younger brother, forced to make impossible choices, to do whatever it took to survive. "I tried to do it the right way," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "I worked hard. I played by the rules. But the rules are rigged, Isabella. They're rigged against people like us." He'd turned to outlawry out of desperation, a way to provide for his family, a way to get revenge on the men who had destroyed his father. But it had become a way of life, a trap he couldn't escape. "I'm not proud of what I've done," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "But I don't regret it. I did what I had to do." Isabella listened, her heart aching for him. She understood his anger, his bitterness, his desperation. She had seen the same injustices in Dusterville, the way the rich and powerful preyed on the weak, the way the law often served the interests of the few, not the many. "There's always a choice," she said softly. Maverick shook his head. "Not always. Sometimes the only choice is between bad and worse." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. "You're different, Isabella. You see the good in people, even when there's not much good to see." "Everyone has good in them," Isabella said. "Sometimes it's just buried deep." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a feather-light touch that sent shivers down her spine. "You're a fool," he whispered, his voice husky. "A beautiful, innocent fool." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative kiss, a question rather than a demand. Isabella didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, her senses overwhelmed by his scent, by the warmth of his breath on her skin, by the electricity that crackled between them. The kiss deepened, tentative at first, then more urgent, more demanding. It was a kiss born of desperation, of longing, of a forbidden desire that had been simmering beneath the surface since the moment they met. It was a kiss that tasted of danger and regret, of hope and despair. Isabella knew it was wrong, that she should stop him, that she should push him away. She was a healer, a woman of peace, and he was an outlaw, a man of violence. Their worlds were too far apart, their paths too divergent. Yet she couldn't resist him. She was drawn to him, to his strength, to his vulnerability, to the fire that burned in his eyes. He pulled back, his breathing ragged, his eyes searching hers. "This is madness," he whispered. "Yes," Isabella agreed, her voice trembling. "It is." But neither of them made a move to break the connection. They remained there, bathed in the moonlight, caught in the web of their impossible desire. The bandit moon, a silent witness to their forbidden embrace, hung high above them, a reminder of the risks they were taking, of the consequences they might face. The only other sounds were the soft night noises of the canyon wildlife, the distant howl of the coyote now feeling like a warning, and the frantic beat of Isabella's own heart. Chapter 5. The Price of a Promise. The fragile peace of the canyon was shattered by the arrival of a rider, dust billowing behind him like a vengeful spirit. It was early morning, the sun just beginning to paint the canyon walls with gold, and Isabella was tending to Ben, changing his bandages. The rider was one of Maverick's men, a scout, his face grim, his horse lathered in sweat. "Sheriff's posse," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "Headed this way. 20 men, maybe more." A wave of cold dread washed over Isabella. The law, Sheriff Harding. He was a relentless man, driven by a rigid sense of justice, and he had a particular vendetta against Maverick. He'd been hunting him for years, and he wouldn't hesitate to use Isabella as bait, or worse, to get to him. The camp erupted in activity. Men scrambled for their weapons, their horses, their faces taut with tension. Maverick barked orders, his voice sharp and commanding, his earlier vulnerability gone, replaced by the hardened demeanor of an outlaw leader. "We ride," he said, his gaze sweeping the camp. "Now." Isabella's mind raced. She couldn't leave Ben, not yet. He was still weak, still recovering. Moving him now could kill him. But staying meant facing the sheriff, facing the possibility of imprisonment, or worse. She looked at Maverick, her eyes pleading. "He can't be moved," she said, her voice firm, despite the fear that was churning in her stomach. "Not yet." Maverick's gaze met hers, his expression unreadable. He hesitated for a moment, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering between Isabella and his brother. The conflict within him was palpable. "We stay," he said finally, his voice low. "We make a stand." The decision was met with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Some of the men grumbled, their fear evident, but they obeyed. Maverick was their leader, and they trusted his judgment, even when it seemed reckless. Finch, Maverick's ever-present shadow, stepped forward, his voice laced with suspicion. "This is a mistake, Maverick. We're sitting ducks in this canyon." "We have the advantage of terrain," Maverick replied, his gaze fixed on Finch. "And we have Isabella." The implication was clear. Isabella was their shield, their hostage, their bargaining chip. She was the price of Ben's survival, the price of Maverick's promise to his brother. A wave of anger washed over Isabella, anger at Maverick, at the situation, at the unfairness of it all. She was a healer, not a pawn in their game of cat and mouse. "I'm not your shield," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "I'm not your hostage." Maverick turned to her, his eyes softening slightly. "You're a complication, Isabella," he said, his voice low. "A complication I didn't plan for." Oh, he reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a fleeting touch that belied the harshness of his words. "But you're here, and I won't let them hurt you." It was a promise, a vow, and Isabella knew, despite everything, that he meant it. He would protect her, even if it meant risking his own life, even if it meant facing the full force of the law. The outlaws prepared for the confrontation, fortifying their position, setting up defenses. The canyon, once a refuge, now felt like a trap, a cage. The air was thick with tension, with the scent of fear and gunpowder. Isabella watched them, her heart heavy with dread. She had made a choice to stay, a choice to help Ben, a choice to trust Maverick. And now she had to live with the consequences, whatever they may be. She was caught between two worlds, between the law and the outlaw, between duty and desire, between her head and her heart. The price of her promise was steep, and she knew that the coming confrontation would test her courage, her loyalty, and her love in ways she could never have imagined. The sound of the preparations, the clatter of weapons, the hushed voices, all blended with the natural sounds of the canyon, creating a symphony of impending doom. The price of a promise, she realized, was often paid in blood. Chapter 6. Scars of the Past. The waiting was the hardest part. The posse was close. They could hear the distant rumble of horses' hooves, the occasional shout carried on the wind. The sun climbed higher in the sky, turning the canyon into a furnace, the heat intensifying the already suffocating tension. Isabella tended to Ben, her hands moving automatically, her mind racing. She tried to focus on her task, on keeping him calm, on preparing for the inevitable. Maverick was everywhere, checking defenses, issuing orders, his presence a reassuring force in the chaos. He moved with a quiet intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the canyon rim, his hand never far from his revolver. He was a warrior preparing for battle, a leader protecting his flock. He stopped beside Isabella, his gaze lingering on her face. "Stay close to Ben," he said, his voice low. "And stay down." "What about you?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll be fine," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I always am." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He was walking into a firestorm, and there was no guarantee he would walk out. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. It was a brief, tender gesture, a moment of intimacy in the midst of chaos. "I never meant for this to happen," he said, his voice rough. "For you to be caught up in this." "I made my choice," Isabella replied, her voice firm. "I'm not afraid." It wasn't entirely true. She was afraid, terrified, but she wouldn't let her fear control her. She wouldn't let it break her. Maverick leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead, a fleeting kiss, a silent promise. Then he was gone, melting back into the shadows, preparing for the fight. Isabella watched him go, her heart aching. She knew so little about him, about his past, about the scars that marked him, both visible and invisible. Yet she felt connected to him, bound to him by a force she couldn't explain, a force that transcended logic and reason. As she waited, Finch approached her, his scarred face twisted in a sneer. "You're trouble. You know that?" he said, his voice harsh. "Maverick's gone soft because of you." Isabella met his gaze, her own unwavering. "He cares about his brother," she said. "That's not weakness." Finch scoffed. "Sentiment is a weakness in this life. It'll get you killed." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her. "You got a past, you know," he said, his voice low. "A past that haunts him. A woman." Isabella's heart clenched. A woman, of course. There had to be. "What happened to her?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Finch smiled, a cruel, knowing smile. "She died," he said. "Because of him? Because of the life he chose." He walked away, leaving Isabella with his words hanging in the air, heavy with implication. A woman, a past, a death. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a picture that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. Maverick's pain, his regret, his self-imposed isolation. It all made sense now. He was haunted by his past, by the choices he had made, by the woman he had lost. And Isabella was walking down the same path, risking the same fate. The first shots rang out, shattering the silence, signaling the start of the battle. Isabella huddled beside Ben, her heart pounding in her chest. The canyon echoed with the sounds of gunfire, of shouts, of screams. The price of her promise, the weight of Maverick's past, the reality of her present danger, it all converged, pressing down on her with the force of a physical blow. The scars of the past, she realized, were not just Maverick's. They were becoming her own. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the metallic tang of blood. Chapter 7. Where the River Bends. The battle raged, a chaotic dance of death and survival. The canyon walls echoed with the deafening roar of gunfire, the screams of men, the whinnies of terrified horses. Isabella stayed low, huddled beside Ben, her hands covering his ears, trying to shield him from the worst of the noise. She prayed, a silent, desperate plea for it to end, for them to survive. From her sheltered position, she could see glimpses of the fight. Maverick was a whirlwind of motion, a deadly force, his revolver spitting fire, his movements precise and lethal. He was fighting not just for survival, but for something more, for redemption, perhaps, or for a chance to protect the woman he was beginning to care for. Finch was beside him, his scarred face contorted in a grimace of determination, his rifle firing with deadly accuracy. He was a loyal soldier, a ruthless killer, but even he seemed to be fighting with a newfound ferocity, perhaps driven by a desire to protect his leader, or perhaps by something darker, something more personal. The outlaws were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of terrain. They fought from behind rocks, from within crevices, using the canyon's natural defenses to their advantage. But the sheriff's posse was relentless, pushing forward, their numbers overwhelming. Isabella saw Silas go down, a bullet piercing his chest. He fell with a cry, his body slumping to the ground. She wanted to go to him, to help him, but she knew it was too late. He was gone. The sight of his death filled her with a cold rage. These were men she had come to know, men she had cared for, men who, despite their flaws, had shown her kindness and respect. And they were dying one by one because of a choice she had made, a choice to stay, a choice to help. Suddenly a bullet whizzed past her head, embedding itself in the rock wall beside her. Isabella gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked up and saw a deputy, his face contorted with hatred, his rifle aimed directly at her. He fired again, and Isabella closed her eyes, bracing for the impact. But the shot never came. Instead, she heard a grunt, a thud, and when she opened her eyes, she saw Maverick standing over her, his body shielding her, his revolver smoking. The deputy lay on the ground, a bullet hole in his forehead. Maverick had killed him, saving her life. He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fury. "I told you to stay down," he said, his voice harsh. Isabella couldn't speak. She was trembling, her body shaking with shock and adrenaline. Maverick reached down, his hand gently cupping her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softer now. Isabella shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Silas," she whispered. Maverick's gaze followed hers, landing on Silas's lifeless body. His jaw tightened, his eyes hardening. He closed his eyes for a moment, a silent tribute to his fallen comrade. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Now. They're flanking us." He helped her up, his arm supporting her, his presence a source of strength. He led her and Ben, who was semi-conscious, deeper into the canyon, towards a narrow passage, a hidden escape route. They moved quickly, silently, the sounds of the battle fading behind them. They were leaving the dead behind, leaving the chaos, leaving the price of their choices behind. They were running, not towards safety, but towards an uncertain future, a future where the river of their lives had irrevocably bent. They were headed to where it might fork. The sounds of the battle became a distant, muffled roar, replaced by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the rushing of water nearby. Chapter 8. Echoes in the Canyon. The narrow passage opened into a hidden grotto, a secret oasis tucked away within the heart of the canyon. A small waterfall cascaded down the rock face, feeding a clear, cool stream that meandered through the lush vegetation. It was a place of unexpected beauty, a stark contrast to the violence and chaos they had left behind. Maverick helped Ben settle near the stream, his movements gentle despite his own exhaustion and injuries. He had a bullet graze on his arm, a long, bloody furrow that Isabella quickly tended to. "We're safe here," Maverick said, his voice weary. "For now." Isabella looked around, her gaze sweeping the grotto. It was a beautiful place, a sanctuary, but it was also a prison. They were trapped, cut off from the world, their future uncertain. "What now?" she asked, her voice echoing the stillness. Maverick didn't answer. He sat down heavily, his back against the rock wall, his eyes closed. He looked defeated, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Isabella sat beside him, her shoulder touching his. She could feel the tension in his body, the weight of his responsibilities, the burden of his past. "I am sorry," she said softly. "About Silas. About all of this." Maverick opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. "It's not your fault," he said, his voice rough. "It's the life I chose." "But it's my life now, too," Isabella said. "I'm a part of this, whether I want to be or not." He reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch sending a shiver through her. "You could have left," he said. "You could have gone with the sheriff." "And let Ben die?" Isabella shook her head. "I couldn't do that. I wouldn't." "You're too good for this world, Isabella," Maverick said, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and regret. "Too good for me." "Don't say that," Isabella said, her voice trembling. You're not what they say you are." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "What do they say I am? A killer, a thief, an outlaw?" "They say you're dangerous," Isabella said. "But they don't see the other side of you. The side that cares, the side that protects, the side that loves." The word hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Oh, they both felt it, the pull between them, the connection that had grown stronger with each passing day, with each shared danger. Maverick looked at her, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored her own. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss. A kiss that spoke of hope and despair, of love and loss. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate. It was a kiss that defied the odds, that ignored the danger, that embraced the impossible. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, binding them together in a way that nothing could break. Suddenly a noise broke the silence, the sound of footsteps approaching. Maverick pulled back, his hand instantly reaching for his revolver. He stood up, his body tense, his eyes scanning the entrance to the grotto. There was Finch. He stood there, his scarred face pale, his clothes torn and bloodied. He looked like a ghost, a specter of the battle they had left behind. "They're gone," he said, his voice hoarse. "The posse, they retreated. They took heavy losses." Relief washed over Isabella, a wave of exhaustion, following close behind. They had survived. They had won. But at what cost? Maverick lowered his revolver, his body relaxing slightly. "And the others?" he asked. Finch shook his head, his eyes filled with grief. They're all gone, Maverick. Every last one of them. Except us. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of loss, of finality. The echoes of the battle, the screams, the gunshots, the cries of the dying, they all seemed to reverberate in the stillness of the grotto, a haunting reminder of the price of their victory. The victory felt hollow, tainted by the blood that had been spilled, by the lives that had been lost. Isabella looked at Maverick, his face etched with pain, his eyes filled with a grief that mirrored her own. The canyon, once a place of refuge, now felt like a tomb, a monument to their shared sorrow. Only the three of them had made it to this quiet place, and everything that had happened before seemed like a loud, distant, bad dream. Chapter 9. A Glimmer of Grace. The following days were a blur of grief and recovery. They buried the dead, a somber task that weighed heavily on their hearts. Maverick, Finch, and Isabella worked together, their movements silent and efficient, their faces etched with sorrow. They built makeshift graves, marking them with stones, a silent tribute to the men who had fallen. Ben slowly began to recover, his strength returning with each passing day. Isabella tended to him tirelessly, her skills as a healer pushed to their limits. She used the last of her herbs, supplementing them with what she could find in the grotto, her knowledge of the natural world proving invaluable. The grotto itself became their sanctuary, a place of healing and reflection. The waterfall provided fresh water, the surrounding vegetation offered sustenance, and the hidden location offered a measure of safety. They were cut off from the world, isolated, but they were alive. Maverick was withdrawn, haunted by the loss of his men, by the weight of his leadership. He spent hours alone, staring into the distance, his thoughts a mystery. He was a shadow of his former self, the fire in his eyes dimmed, his spirit broken. Isabella watched him, her heart aching for him. She understood his pain, his guilt, his regret. She knew that he blamed himself for what had happened, that he carried the burden of their deaths on his shoulders. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the grotto, Isabella found Maverick sitting by the stream, his gaze fixed on the flowing water. She sat down beside him, her presence a silent offering of comfort. "They were good men," she said softly, breaking the silence. Maverick didn't respond, his gaze unwavering. "They followed you," Isabella continued. "They trusted you." "And I led them to their deaths," Maverick said, his voice harsh. "You led them to fight for what they believed in," Isabella said. "For a chance at a better life." "A better life?" Maverick scoffed. "There's no such thing for men like us." "There's always hope," Isabella said, her voice firm. "There's always a chance for redemption." She reached out, her hand covering his, her touch sending a warmth through him. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. "You believe that, don't you?" he asked. "Even after everything you've seen?" "I have to believe it," Isabella said. Otherwise, what's the point?" He turned his hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, their connection a lifeline in the darkness. He leaned his head against hers, his breath warm on her cheek. "You're a glimmer of grace, Isabella," he whispered, his voice husky, "in a world that's lost its way." They sat there for a long time, their silence filled with unspoken emotions, with shared grief, with a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way out of the darkness, together. The sound of water trickling seemed to wash their grief away. Finch watched from a distance. He was working on his weapons, cleaning and preparing. It was a quiet task, but a meaningful one. For the first time, Isabella realized the small light on the horizon. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a chance, however slim, for all of them to find a way back to grace. The setting sun created long shadows within the grotto, a somber reminder, but the light, Isabella knew, would always return. Chapter 10. The Unforgiven. The tentative peace of the grotto was shattered by a discovery. Finch, while scouting the surrounding area, found a fresh set of tracks, the unmistakable signs of a lone rider. They were not the tracks of the posse. These were different, newer. Someone was out there, someone who knew their location, someone who posed a threat. Maverick's demeanor shifted instantly. The grief-stricken leader was gone, replaced by the hardened outlaw, his eyes cold, his movements precise and lethal. He was a predator once more, his senses heightened, his instincts honed. "Who is it?" Isabella asked, her voice laced with apprehension. "I don't know," Maverick replied, his gaze sweeping the canyon rim. "But they're not friendly." He turned to Finch, his voice sharp. "Find them, and bring them to me." Finch nodded, his scarred face grim. He melted into the shadows, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. Isabella watched him go, her heart filled with a growing sense of unease. This was a different Maverick, a darker Maverick, a man driven by a need for vengeance, for control. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Maverick looked at her, his eyes unreadable. "Whatever it takes," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Isabella knew what he meant. He would kill whoever was out there without hesitation, without remorse. He was the unforgiven, a man trapped in a cycle of violence, a man who saw no other way. She wanted to argue, to plead with him, to tell him that there was another way, but she knew it was futile. He was too far gone, too consumed by his past, by his demons. The hours that followed were filled with tension. Isabella tended to Ben, her hands moving automatically, her mind racing. She prayed for Finch to return, for the threat to be neutralized, for the violence to end. As night fell, Finch returned, his face grim, his clothes covered in dust. He was alone. "I lost them," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "They're good. Too good." Maverick cursed, his frustration evident. He paced the grotto, his hand never far from his revolver. "They'll be back," he said, his voice low. "They know we're here." Isabella's fear intensified. They were trapped, exposed, vulnerable. And Maverick. Maverick was a ticking time bomb ready to explode. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "There has to be another way," she said. "We can't just keep killing." Maverick stopped pacing, his gaze fixed on her. "There is no other way," he said, his voice harsh. "This is the life we live. Kill or be killed." "But it doesn't have to be," Isabella said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We can change. We can choose a different path." Maverick shook his head, his eyes filled with a sadness that pierced Isabella's heart. "It's too late," he said. "For me. For us." He turned away, his shoulders slumping, his spirit broken. He was the unforgiven, a man condemned to a life of violence, a man who had lost all hope of redemption. And Isabella was caught in his web, trapped by her love for him, by her desire to save him, even from himself. She stared at the campfire. The flames danced. It was a mesmerizing and dangerous rhythm. It echoed the rhythm of Maverick's heart and the impossible choices. The unknown rider, Isabella knew, was a symbol of a past that would always find them, and a future that remained a dangerous, terrifying question. Chapter 11. Secrets in the Saddlebag. Days turned into nights, marked by an uneasy truce with the unknown. The unseen threat lingered, a shadow lurking just beyond their reach, Maverick remained on high alert, his senses honed, his sleep fitful. Finch, ever vigilant, patrolled the perimeter, a silent guardian. Isabella tended to Ben, whose recovery was slow but steady, and tried to find solace in the routine, in the small acts of healing that gave her purpose. One afternoon, while searching for medicinal herbs near the stream, Isabella stumbled upon something unexpected. Hidden beneath a pile of rocks, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation, was an old, weathered saddlebag. It was clearly not one of their own. It was too worn, too different in style. Curiosity piqued. Isabella opened the bag. Inside, she found a collection of items, a few gold coins, a tarnished silver locket, a folded piece of paper, and a small, leather-bound journal. The paper was a wanted poster, yellowed and brittle with age. It featured a drawing of a man, a younger Maverick, his eyes less haunted, his face less scarred. The reward offered was substantial. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. This was evidence, proof of Maverick's past, a past he had tried so hard to bury. But it was the journal that truly captured her attention. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, the entries filled with a mixture of love and despair. She began to read, her heart pounding in her chest. The journal belonged to a woman named Eliza, Maverick's wife. She wrote of their early days together, of their dreams, of their love, a love that had blossomed amidst hardship and poverty. She wrote of Maverick's struggle to provide for them, of his growing desperation, of his descent into outlawry. And then the entries took a darker turn. Eliza wrote of her fear, of her pleas for Maverick to leave that life behind, of her growing sense of dread. The final entry was heartbreaking, a desperate cry for help, a premonition of her own death. "He won't listen," she wrote. "He's too far gone. The darkness has consumed him. I fear for our lives, for our souls. I see a shadow coming, a shadow that will take everything from us." Isabella closed the journal, her hands trembling. Eliza's words echoed in her mind, a chilling prophecy that had come true. She understood now the depth of Maverick's pain, the source of his guilt, the reason for his self-imposed isolation. He blamed himself for Eliza's death, for the life he had chosen, for the darkness that had consumed him. She looked up and saw Maverick watching her, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of dread and resignation. He had seen the saddlebag. He knew what she had found. "It was hers," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Eliza's." Isabella nodded, her heart aching for him. "I read it," she said. "I know." Maverick closed his eyes, his body slumping. He looked like a broken man, a man stripped bare, his secrets exposed. "She was everything to me," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "And I lost her. Because of who I am. Because of what I did." Isabella reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "You were trying to protect her, to provide for her." "But I failed," Maverick said, his voice harsh. "I failed her, and I'll fail you too." "No," Isabella said, her voice firm. "You won't. We can change. We can find a different way." Maverick shook his head, his eyes filled with despair. "It's too late, Isabella. The past, it always catches up." The secrets in the saddlebag had revealed a truth that was both painful and liberating. They had exposed Maverick's vulnerability, his humanity, his capacity for love. But they had also reinforced the shadow that hung over them, the shadow of the past, the shadow of the unknown rider, the shadow of a fate they could not escape. The journal lay on the ground between them, a tangible symbol of a love lost, and a stark warning of a future that might repeat the tragic past. Chapter 12. Crossroads of the Heart. The discovery of Eliza's journal and the wanted poster created a rift between Isabella and Maverick, a silent chasm of unspoken grief and unresolved guilt. He withdrew further into himself, his silence more profound, his eyes haunted by a past he couldn't escape. Isabella tried to reach him, to offer comfort, but he remained distant, unreachable. Ben, sensing the tension, became increasingly restless. He was recovering physically, but the emotional wounds of the battle, the loss of his comrades, and the uncertainty of their future weighed heavily on him. He looked to Maverick for guidance, for reassurance, but his brother was lost in his own darkness. One evening, as Isabella was tending to Ben's wounds, he spoke, his voice hesitant. "He blames himself, you know," he said, his gaze fixed on Isabella. "For everything." Isabella nodded, her heart aching for both brothers. "I know," she said softly. "He loved her," Ben continued. "Eliza, more than anything." "I know that too," Isabella said, her voice trembling slightly. "He changed after she died," Ben said. "He became harder, colder. He shut everyone out." "He's hurting, Ben," Isabella said. "He needs time." "Time won't heal those wounds," Ben said, his voice filled with a wisdom beyond his years. "Only love can do that." He looked at Isabella, his eyes searching hers. "He cares about you," he said. "I can see it. Don't give up on him." Isabella's heart clenched. She loved Maverick, she knew that now, with a certainty that defied logic and reason. But love wasn't always enough. Love couldn't erase the past. It couldn't change who he was. It couldn't guarantee a future. Later that night, Isabella found Maverick sitting by the stream, his gaze fixed on the flowing water. She sat down beside him, her presence a silent question. "I found something else," she said, her voice soft. "In the saddlebag." She handed him the tarnished silver locket. He took it, his fingers trembling slightly. He opened it, revealing a miniature portrait of Eliza, her smile radiant, her eyes full of life. Maverick stared at the portrait, his face a mask of pain. He closed his eyes, his body shaking with silent sobs. Isabella reached out, her hand gently touching his back. She didn't speak. She simply offered her presence, her comfort, her love. After a long time, Maverick opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't deserve your kindness, your compassion, your love." "Don't say that," Isabella said, her voice firm. "Everyone deserves love, Maverick. Everyone deserves a second chance." "But I've had my second chance," he said. "And I wasted it. I ruined it." "It's not too late," Isabella said. "We can start over. We can leave this life behind. We can find a new path." Maverick looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "Do you really believe that?" he asked. "I have to," Isabella said. "I have to believe that love can conquer anything, even the darkest of pasts." She leaned in, her lips brushing against his, a soft, tentative kiss. A kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of hope, of a future they might build together. It was a crossroads of the heart, a moment of decision, a choice between the shadows of the past and the promise of a new dawn. The choice, Isabella realized, was not just Maverick's. It was hers, too. She had to choose between the safe, predictable life she had left behind and the dangerous, uncertain future that lay ahead with this broken, beautiful outlaw. The locket lay open in Maverick's hand, Eliza's smiling image a reminder of what he had lost, and a silent plea for him to choose a different path. The stream flowed beside them, its gentle murmur a symbol of the constant flow of time and the choices that shaped a life. Chapter 13. The Devil's Bargain. The fragile hope that had blossomed between Isabella and Maverick was threatened by the return of the unknown rider. Finch, on one of his scouting patrols, spotted the riders' tracks again, closer this time, more deliberate. They were being hunted, stalked, and the pressure was mounting. Maverick became increasingly agitated, his sleep plagued by nightmares, his days filled with a restless energy. He was a caged animal, pacing the confines of the grotto, his hand never far from his revolver. "We need to leave," Isabella said, her voice laced with concern. "We can't stay here." Maverick shook his head, his eyes dark. "We can't run," he said. "He'll just keep following us." "Then we fight," Finch said, his voice hard. "We make a stand." "No," Isabella said, her voice firm. "No more fighting, no more killing." She looked at Maverick, her eyes pleading. "There has to be another way," she said. Maverick met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He was torn, caught between his desire to protect her, to protect Ben, and his ingrained instinct to fight, to survive at any cost. Suddenly a voice echoed through the grotto, a voice that was both familiar and menacing. "Maverick!" The voice came from the entrance to the grotto, amplified by the canyon walls. It was a man's voice, deep and resonant, filled with a chilling authority. Maverick's body stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. He knew that voice. He had hoped never to hear it again. "Who is it?" Isabella whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Sheriff Harding," Maverick replied, his voice barely audible. Harding. The relentless lawman who had hunted him for years, the man who had sworn to bring him to justice, dead or alive. Harding stepped into the grotto, his figure silhouetted against the sunlight. He was a tall, imposing man, his face weathered and lined, his eyes cold and unforgiving. He held a rifle in his hands, his posture relaxed but alert. "It's over, Maverick," Harding said, his voice echoing through the grotto. "Surrender." Maverick didn't move, his gaze fixed on Harding. He was trapped, cornered, his past finally catching up to him. "I have a proposition," he offers. "I have you, Maverick," Harding said, his voice cold. "I won't bargain." "Not for me," Maverick clarifies. "For them, for the woman, the boy." "They aided a criminal," Harding's tone does not soften. "They saved my brother, your prisoner aided, and nursed a wounded man back. They deserve a chance, Sheriff." Harding was silent. The offer hung between them, heavy and dangerous. "I will turn myself in. You will forget they ever existed," Maverick offered. It was a devil's bargain, a sacrifice, a desperate attempt to save the woman he loved and the brother he had sworn to protect. He was offering his own freedom, his own life, in exchange for theirs. He was choosing the path of redemption, a path that led to his own destruction. Isabella gasped, her eyes wide with horror. "No, Maverick," she cried. "You can't." Maverick looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that pierced her heart. "It's the only way," he said. "The only way to keep you safe." Harding considered his silence was agonizing. The only sounds were the water dripping and Ben's shallow breathing. "Oh, very well," the sheriff finally agreed. "One life in exchange for two innocents. A fair trade. Maverick." He stepped forward, his hand outstretched, offering Maverick a pair of handcuffs. It was a devil's bargain, a moment of truth, a choice that would determine their fates. The canyon held its breath, the silence broken only by the rushing water and the beating of Isabella's heart. Chapter 14. Blood on the Horizon. The handcuffs clicked shut, the metallic sound echoing through the grotto, a stark symbol of Maverick's surrender, of his sacrifice. Sheriff Harding, his face impassive, stepped back, his rifle still trained on Maverick. "Let them go," Maverick said, his voice firm, his gaze fixed on Harding. Harding nodded, a curt gesture of agreement. "They're free to leave," he said, "once we're clear of the canyon." Isabella rushed to Maverick's side, her hands reaching for him, her eyes filled with tears. "No," she cried. "I won't leave you." Maverick looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. "You have to," he said. "It's the only way." He leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead, a fleeting kiss, a silent goodbye. "Live, Isabella," he whispered. "Live for both of us." Ben, his face pale but resolute, stepped forward. "I'm staying with him," he said, his voice firm. Harding shook his head. "The deal was for the woman," he said. "You're coming with me." "He's my brother," Ben said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I won't abandon him." Maverick looked at Ben, his eyes filled with pride and gratitude. "Go with Isabella," he said. "Live a good life, Ben. Be the man I never could be." It was a heartbreaking scene, a tableau of love and sacrifice, of impossible choices and devastating consequences. The three of them, bound together by fate, by circumstance, by a love that defied the odds, were being torn apart. Finch, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward, his scarred face contorted in a grimace of anger. "This ain't right, Sheriff," he said, his voice harsh. "You can't just take him." Harding turned to Finch, his eyes cold. "He's a wanted man, Finch," he said. "He's committed crimes. He has to pay." "He saved your damn life," Finch retorted, his hand moving towards his revolver. "Don't be a fool, Finch," Harding said, his voice warning. "Drop your weapon." Finch hesitated, his hand hovering over his revolver, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and despair. He looked at Maverick, a silent question in his gaze. Maverick shook his head, a barely perceptible movement. "It's over, Finch," he said. "Let it go." Finch's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling. He slowly lowered his hand, his gaze fixed on the ground. He knew it was over. They had lost. Harding gestured with his rifle, indicating the entrance to the grotto. "Let's go," he said. Maverick, his hands cuffed, his head held high, walked towards the exit, his steps measured and deliberate. He didn't look back. Isabella watched him go, her heart breaking. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, anything to stop him. But she knew it was futile. He had made his choice. He had chosen to sacrifice himself to save her, to save Ben. As Maverick disappeared from view, escorted by Harding and his deputies, a shot rang out, shattering the silence. Isabella gasped, her blood running cold. She knew with a chilling certainty what had happened. She ran towards the entrance to the grotto, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw them, a cluster of figures, standing over a fallen body. It was Maverick. He lay on the ground, his chest covered in blood, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. Finch stood over him, his revolver smoking, his face a mask of grief and rage. He had shot Maverick. He had killed him. "Why?" Isabella screamed, her voice filled with anguish. "Why did you do it?" Finch looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "He wouldn't have survived," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not in prison, not with Harding. It was a mercy." It was a lie, a desperate attempt to justify his actions, to ease his own guilt. He had killed Maverick, not out of mercy, but out of rage, out of a twisted sense of loyalty, out of a desire to prevent his friend from facing a fate he considered worse than death. The horizon was starting to redden. Blood had been spilled again. The shot echoed, and the sound mixed with Isabella's sobs, marking an irreversible turning point. The choice had been taken away. The future had been decided. Chapter 15. A handful of dust. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the vibrant colors of the canyon fading to a dull, lifeless gray. Isabella knelt beside Maverick, her hands hovering over his body and her mind unable to comprehend the reality of his death. He was gone. The man she loved, The man who had sacrificed himself for her was gone. Sheriff Harding, his face a mixture of shock and regret, stood over them, his rifle lowered. He had not expected this, had not anticipated Finch's desperate act. He had won. He had captured his quarry, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the blood that had been spilled. "Get him out of here," Harding said, his voice gruff, gesturing to his deputies. "Take him back to town." The deputies hesitated, their eyes flickering between Harding and Finch, who still stood there, his revolver smoking, his face a mask of grief and defiance. "He's coming with us," Harding said, his gaze fixed on Finch. "He'll stand trial for murder." Finch didn't resist. He allowed the deputies to disarm him, to bind his hands, his spirit broken, his will to fight extinguished. Isabella remained beside Maverick, her tears falling silently onto his lifeless face. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the lines of his jaw, the curve of his lips, the scars that marked his past. She remembered his touch, his kiss, his words, his sacrifice. She remembered the man he was, the man he could have been, the man she had loved. Ben knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his own tears mangling with hers. He had lost his brother, his hero, his protector. He was alone now, adrift in a world that had suddenly become cold and unforgiving. "We have to bury him," Isabella said, her voice choked with emotion. "Here, in the grotto." Harding hesitated, his gaze shifting between Isabella and Ben. He was a lawman, bound by duty, by rules, but he was also a human being, capable of compassion. "You have until nightfall," he said, his voice softer now. "Then we leave." It was a small concession, a gesture of respect, a recognition of their grief. Isabella and Ben worked together, their movements silent and efficient, their hearts heavy with sorrow. They dug a grave near the waterfall, a place of peace and beauty, a fitting resting place for the man they had loved. They wrapped Maverick's body in a blanket, the same blanket that Isabella had used to keep him warm on those cold desert nights. They laid him in the grave, his face turned towards the sky, his hands folded across his chest. Isabella knelt beside the grave, her hand resting on cold earth. She picked up a handful of dust, the dust of the canyon, the dust of the land he had loved, the land that had claimed him. "Goodbye, Maverick," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My love, my outlaw." She let the dust fall from her hand, scattering it over his body, a final farewell, a silent promise to remember him, to honor his sacrifice, to live the life he had given her. Ben stood beside her, his silence more profound than any words. The weight of the loss settled within both, and neither knew what the future now held. The sun continued to set, casting a red and unforgiving hue. The dust settled, and it was a powerful image, a closure of one chapter, and a terrifying signal that a new, uncertain one was about to begin. Chapter 16. Whispers of Redemption. Nightfall descended upon the canyon, casting long, somber shadows that mirrored the grief in Isabella's heart. As promised, Sheriff Harding and his deputies prepared to depart, taking Finch with them as their prisoner. The grotto, once a sanctuary, now felt like a desolate tomb, haunted by the ghost of Maverick. Isabella and Ben stood by Maverick's grave, the freshly turned earth a stark reminder of their loss. The sound of the waterfall, once soothing, now seemed like a mournful lament. "We should go with them," Ben said, his voice low and hesitant. "Back to Dusterville." Isabella shook her head. "I can't," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Not yet." She couldn't face the familiar streets, the sympathetic glances, the whispers of the townspeople. She couldn't bear the thought of returning to her old life, a life that no longer held any meaning without Maverick. Harding approached them, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond the physical. He looked at Isabella, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding. "You're welcome to come back with us," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Dusterville is your home." Isabella met his gaze, her own unwavering. "This is my home now," she said, gesturing to the canyon, to Maverick's grave. "For a while, at least." Harding nodded, accepting her decision. He turned to Ben. "What about you, son?" he asked. Ben hesitated, his gaze flickering between Isabella and the departing posse. He was torn, caught between his loyalty to his brother's memory and his desire for safety, for a return to normalcy. I don't know," he stammered. Isabella placed a hand on his arm, her touch reassuring. "Go with them, Ben," she said. "It's what Maverick would have wanted." She knew it was true. Maverick had sacrificed himself to save them, to give them a chance at a better life. He wouldn't want Ben to stay here, to wallow in grief, to risk his own future. Ben looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "But what about you?" he asked. "I'll be all right," Isabella said, forcing a smile. "I need some time to heal, to think." She knew it was a lie. She wouldn't be all right. She would never be the same. But she couldn't burden Ben with her grief, with her uncertainty. He deserved a chance at happiness, a chance to escape the darkness that had consumed their lives. Ben, after a long, agonizing silence, finally nodded. He embraced Isabella, a tight, desperate hug that spoke volumes of their shared loss, their bond, their uncertain future. "I'll come back for you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I promise." Isabella watched as Ben rode away with Harding and his deputies, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the darkness. She was alone now, truly alone, with only the ghost of Maverick and the echoes of the canyon for company. She turned back to the grave, her hand resting on the cold earth. She felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of her fate. She had lost everything, but she had also found something within herself, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She would stay in the canyon for a while at least. She would tend to Maverick's grave. She would learn to survive in this harsh, unforgiving land. She would find a way to honor his memory, to live the life he had given her. As the first rays of dawn crept over the canyon walls, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Isabella whispered a silent vow. "I will not forget you, Maverick," she said. "I will live my life with courage, with compassion, with love. I will find my own redemption in this place where you found yours." The whispers of the canyon seemed to answer, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves, a silent promise of hope, of healing, of a future that, while uncertain, was not entirely without light. It was a new beginning, forged in grief, tempered by loss, but infused with a quiet determination to carry on, to honor the past, and to embrace the unknown. Chapter 17. The Long Ride Home. Weeks turned into months. Isabella adapted to life in the canyon, her initial grief gradually giving way to a quiet resilience. She learned to hunt, to forage, to find sustenance in the harsh landscape. She tended to Maverick's grave, keeping it free of weeds, decorating it with wildflowers, a silent tribute to the man she had loved. The grotto became her sanctuary, her refuge, her home. She found a strange solace in the solitude, in the silence broken only by the sounds of nature. She spent hours by the stream, reading Eliza's journal, learning more about the man Maverick had been, the woman he had loved, the life he had lost. She discovered a hidden strength within herself, a capacity for survival, for independence that she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer the naive healer from Dusterville. She was a woman forged in the crucible of loss and hardship, a woman who had stared death in the face and emerged stronger, more determined. One day, as she was gathering herbs near the canyon rim, she saw a familiar figure approaching. It was Ben. He rode towards her, his face weathered and tanned, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Isabella's heart leaped with joy. She ran to meet him, her arms embracing him tightly as he dismounted. "You came back," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I promised I would," Ben replied, his voice husky. He looked different, older, more mature. The boyish innocence was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence, a newfound strength. He had grown into a man. "How is everything?" Isabella asked. "Dusterville is, Dusterville," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "It hasn't changed much." He paused, his gaze shifting towards the grotto. "How have you been?" "I'm surviving," Isabella said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I've learned to live here." "You shouldn't have to," Ben said, his voice filled with concern. "You belong back in town, with people, with a life." Isabella shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "I'm not ready." She wasn't ready to face the pitying glances, the whispered condolences, the constant reminders of her loss. She needed more time, more healing, before she could return to the world she had left behind. Ben understood. He didn't push her. He stayed with her for several days, helping her with chores, sharing stories, offering his companionship. He told her about Dusterville, about the changes that had taken place, about the people who missed her. He also told her about Finch. He had been tried for Maverick's murder, found guilty, and sentenced to hang. He had shown no remorse, no regret. His only words a defiant curse directed at Sheriff Harding. Isabella felt a pang of sadness for Finch, a twisted, misguided soul who had ultimately destroyed himself in his attempt to protect the man he considered his friend. As Ben prepared to leave, he looked at Isabella, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You're strong, Isabella," he said. "Stronger than you know." "I had to be," Isabella replied, her voice soft. "Maverick, he would have been proud of you," Ben said. Isabella's heart ached at the mention of Maverick's name. She would always carry his memory with her, a bittersweet reminder of the love they had shared, the sacrifice he had made. "Promise me you won't stay here forever," Ben said, his voice earnest. Isabella smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I promise," she said. "I'll come home. Eventually." She watched as Ben rode away, his figure disappearing into the distance. She was alone again, but she wasn't lonely. She had her memories, her strength, her newfound independence. She turned back to the grotto, to Maverick's grave, to the life she had built for herself. She knew that the long ride home would be difficult, that the scars of the past would always remain. But she also knew that she was ready, that she could face whatever the future held with courage, with compassion, with a love that had been forged in the heart of a wild and unforgiving land. The canyon echoed his departure. The setting sun filled the sky. Isabella watched. She felt stronger. She felt ready. But not yet. Chapter 18. Between Two Fires. Another season turned, painting the canyon in the fiery hues of autumn. Isabella had marked the passage of time by the changing leaves, the shifting patterns of the sun, the cycles of the moon. She had grown leaner, tougher, her hands calloused from work, her spirit tempered by solitude. She was a part of the canyon now, as wild and untamed as the landscape itself. One crisp morning, as she was returning from her usual foraging, she saw smoke rising from the direction of the grotto. Her heart leaped with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Someone was there. But who? She approached cautiously, her hand resting on the knife she now carried at her belt, a skill she'd learned from necessity. As she drew closer, she saw a figure standing near the stream, a man, his back to her. He was tall and lean, his posture familiar. It couldn't be. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She moved closer, her footsteps silent on the soft earth. "Maverick?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man turned, and Isabella's world stopped. It was him. It was Maverick. He was alive. He looked different, thinner, his face bearing a new scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, his eyes filled with a haunted intensity. But it was him. Isabella rushed to him, her arms embracing him tightly, her tears falling freely onto his shoulder. "You're alive," she cried. "But how?" Maverick held her close, his body trembling. "It's a long story," he said, his voice hoarse. He explained, his words halting and fragmented. Finch's shot had been intended to kill, but it had only wounded him, grazing his chest, knocking him unconscious. Harding, believing him dead, had left him for the buzzards, focusing instead on transporting Finch back to town. Maverick had been found by a wandering Native American tribe, healers who had nursed him back to health, using their ancient knowledge of herbs and remedies. He had spent months with them, recovering, learning their ways, finding a measure of peace in their quiet wisdom. "But why didn't you come back?" Isabella asked, her voice filled with a mixture of joy and confusion. "Why did you let us believe you were dead?" Maverick looked away, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I thought it was for the best," he said. "I thought you were better off without me, that I was cursed, that I would only bring you more pain." "But that's not true," Isabella said, her voice firm. "I love you, Maverick. I never stopped loving you." Maverick looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the truth in her gaze, the unwavering love that had survived time, distance, and even death. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face. "I love you too, Isabella," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "More than anything." Their reunion was bittersweet, filled with joy and relief, but also with the lingering shadows of the past, the pain they had both endured, the uncertainty of the future. "What now?" Isabella asked, her voice soft. Maverick looked around, his gaze sweeping the canyon, the grotto, the grave that had been meant for him. "I don't know," he said. "I can't go back to Dusterville. I'm still a wanted man." "We could leave," Isabella said. "Go somewhere else. Start over." Maverick shook his head. "I can't run anymore, Isabella," he said. "I'm tired of running." The sound of a gunshot ripped through the quiet air. A bullet whizzed by, close. "Get down!" Maverick yelled. They were under attack, again. They were caught, literally, between two fires. The past, in the form a revived Maverick, and the present, in the form of those who would never let him be free. The quiet of their reunion shattered, and they were pulled again into the brutal cycle. Chapter 19. The Reckoning. The shots came from the canyon rim, a hail of bullets that sent Isabella and Maverick scrambling for cover behind the rocks near the stream. They were pinned down, exposed, their reunion shattered by the sudden eruption of violence. "Who is it?" Isabella cried, her voice filled with fear. "I don't know," Maverick replied, his voice grim. He peered cautiously over the rocks, his eyes scanning the canyon rim. "But they're not shooting to wound." He had his revolver, the one he'd taken back from his own supplies after his resurrection. But it was little defense against a sustained attack from above. They were outnumbered, outgunned, their situation desperate. As the firing intensified, Maverick realized something. The shots were precise, calculated, not the wild spray of inexperienced gunmen. These were professionals, hunters, men who knew what they were doing. Suddenly a voice echoed through the canyon, a voice that sent a chill down Isabella's spine. "Maverick! Come out and face me! It's time for your reckoning!" It wasn't Harding. The voice was different, younger, filled with a cold, calculating hatred. Maverick's body stiffened. He knew that voice. He had heard it before in his nightmares, in the echoes of his past. "Who is it?" Isabella asked again, her voice trembling. "It's Clay," Maverick replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Clay Hardin." Isabella's eyes widened in confusion. "Hardin? But Sheriff Harding?" "His son," Maverick said, his voice filled with a chilling dread. "He's come for revenge. Clay Hardin, the son of the man who had hunted Maverick for years. The son of the man who had almost brought him to justice. He had grown up in the shadow of his father's obsession, fueled by stories of Maverick's crimes, consumed by a desire for vengeance. And now he had found him. He had come to finish what his father had started. "I know you're down there, Maverick," Clay's voice echoed through the canyon. "Come out and face your death like a man." Maverick knew he had no choice. He couldn't stay hidden, cowering behind the rocks, waiting for Clay and his men to pick them off. He had to confront him. He had to end this once and for all. "Stay here," he said to Isabella, his voice firm. "Stay down." "No," Isabella said, her voice desperate. "I'm coming with you." Maverick shook his head. "This is my fight, Isabella," he said. "You need to stay safe." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a fleeting kiss, a silent promise. Then he was gone, melting into the shadows, moving towards the canyon rim, towards the source of the gunfire, towards his reckoning. Isabella watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She was terrified, but she also knew that he was right. This was his fight, his past, his demons. She could only pray for him, for his survival, for a miracle. The gunfight that followed was brutal and swift. Maverick, using his knowledge of the canyon, his skills as an outlaw, his desperation to survive, fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He moved like a ghost, appearing and disappearing, his revolver spitting fire, his aim deadly accurate. But Clay and his men were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. They pushed forward, their hatred fueling their attack, their determination to kill Maverick unwavering. Isabella, hidden behind the rocks, could only listen to the sounds of the battle, the roar of gunfire, the shouts of men, the screams of the dying. She prayed, a silent, desperate plea for it to end, for Maverick to survive, for them to find a way out of this nightmare. The reckoning had come, a final violent confrontation between the past and the present, between justice and vengeance, between love and loss. The canyon echoed with the sounds of death, and Isabella could only wait, her heart filled with dread, her future hanging in the balance. The sound of the bullets stopped, and the silence, Isabella knew, was far more terrifying. Chapter 20. A Love Forged in Flames. The silence that followed the gunfight was deafening, broken only by the gentle murmur of the stream and Isabella's ragged breathing. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with fear and anticipation. Had Maverick survived? Had Clay? Who had won? She couldn't stay hidden any longer. She had to know. She crawled out from behind the rocks, her movements slow and cautious, her eyes scanning the canyon. She saw them. Two figures, silhouetted against the setting sun, standing near the canyon rim. One was tall and lean, the other shorter and stockier. They were locked in a hand-to-hand struggle, a desperate fight for survival. It was Maverick and Clay. Isabella watched in horror as they grappled, their bodies straining, their faces contorted in rage and exertion. They were close to the edge, the chasm of the canyon floor looming below them, a deadly drop. Clay, fueled by hatred and a thirst for revenge, fought with a savage intensity. He was younger, stronger, his movements fueled by a lifetime of resentment. Maverick, weakened by his previous injuries, his body exhausted from the gunfight, fought with the courage of desperation, his determination to protect Isabella his driving force. They exchanged blows, their fists connecting with bone and flesh, their grunts and cries echoing through the canyon. It was a brutal, primal fight, a struggle to the death. Suddenly Clay lunged forward, his knife flashing in the fading light. He slashed at Maverick, the blade cutting through his shirt, drawing blood. Maverick staggered back, his hand clutching his side, his face pale. He was losing. Isabella screamed, a wordless cry of terror and despair. She couldn't watch this. She couldn't stand by and let Maverick die. She picked up a rock, the largest she could find, and ran towards them, her movements fueled by adrenaline and a desperate love. As Clay raised his knife for the final blow, Isabella struck. She brought the rock down on Clay's head with all her strength, a sickening thud echoing through the canyon. Clay crumpled to the ground, his body limp, his knife clattering on the rocks. He was unconscious, perhaps dead. Isabella dropped the rock, her hands trembling, her body shaking with shock and relief. She had done it. She had saved Maverick. She rushed to his side, her arms embracing him tightly. "Maverick," she cried. "Are you all right?" Maverick looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "I am now," he said, his voice hoarse. He leaned in, his lips finding hers, a desperate kiss, a kiss that spoke of survival, of love, of a future they might finally share. They stood there, silhouetted against the fiery sunset, their bodies entwined, their hearts beating as one. They had survived. They had faced their reckoning, their past, their demons, and they had emerged victorious. But the victory was not without its cost. Clay lay unconscious at their feet, a reminder of the violence they had endured, of the hatred that had almost consumed them. "What do we do with him?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling. Maverick looked at Clay, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resolve. "We leave him," he said, "for the law, for his father." It was a final act of mercy, a refusal to perpetuate the cycle of violence, a choice to embrace a different path. Their love had been forged in flames, tested by death, strengthened by sacrifice. And now, finally, it was time to leave the canyon, to leave the past behind, to build a future together, a future free from the shadows that had haunted them for so long. The setting sun cast a long, final shadow over Clay's body, a symbolic end to the feud, and a hopeful beginning for Maverick and Isabella. The canyon was silent, finally at peace. Epilogue, ashes and echoes. Years passed. The canyon remained a silent sentinel, guarding its secrets, its echoes of violence and love fading into the whispers of the wind. Maverick and Isabella had left that life behind, crossing the state line, changing their names, starting anew. They settled on a small ranch, far from Dusterville, far from the shadows of their past. They built a life together, a life founded on love, on trust, on a shared commitment to peace. They raised a family, 2 children, a boy and a girl, who grew up knowing nothing of their parents' former lives, of the outlaws and the lawmen, of the violence and the sacrifices. Maverick, now known as Ethan, worked the land, his hands calloused from honest labor, his spirit healed by the quiet rhythm of nature. He was a different man, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a gentle contentment. The fire of his outlaw days banked into a warm, steady glow. Isabella, now known as Sarah, continued to heal, using her knowledge of herbs and remedies to help her neighbors, her community. She was respected, loved, her past a secret she guarded carefully, a story she would never share with her children. Ben had stayed in Dusterville, becoming a blacksmith, taking over Elias's forge after the young man had moved on, seeking his fortune elsewhere. He married, had children of his own, and kept in touch with Isabella and Maverick through occasional, carefully worded letters. He never spoke of the past, of the canyon, of the brother he had lost and then found, only to lose again, in a different way. Finch's fate remained a footnote in the dusty annals of Dusterville's history. He was hanged, his defiance unbroken, his loyalty to Maverick unwavering, even in death. Clay Harden had survived Isabella's blow, but he was never the same. He recovered physically, but the emotional scars remained, a constant reminder of his failure, of his father's legacy, of the man who had escaped his grasp. He left Dusterville, disappearing into obscurity, his thirst for revenge unquenched, his spirit broken. Sheriff Harding retired, his relentless pursuit of justice tempered by the bittersweet victory he had achieved, the price he had paid. He lived out his days in quiet contemplation, haunted by the ghosts of the men he had hunted, by the choices he had made. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over their ranch, Maverick Ethan stood beside Isabella Sarah, watching their children play. He reached out, his hand covering hers, their fingers intertwining, a familiar gesture, a silent connection. "Do you ever think about it?" Isabella asked, her voice soft. "About the canyon?" Maverick nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes," he said. "But it feels like a different life, a different world." "It was," Isabella said, "but it made us who we are." Maverick looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that had endured time, distance, and hardship. "It did," he said, "and I wouldn't trade it. Not for anything." They stood there in silence, their love a testament to their resilience, their courage, their ability to overcome the darkness and find their way to the light. The ashes of their past had settled. The echoes of violence had faded. But the love that had been forged in the flames of the canyon remained, a beacon of hope, a promise of a future that was finally, truly their own. The sun dipped below the horizon, and all was at peace.